Welcome to the Pioneer Podcast. This is Ernst Roets. Thank you for listening. We have started this podcast just a few weeks ago, and we are very excited about what has happened over the last few weeks and the great big things that we have lined up. I'm going to jump straight into today's conversation. I'm speaking to you from a hotel room in Washington, D.C. After launching the Afrikaner Foundation on the 4th of July 2024, which was just a little more than a week ago, we departed to the US. Ernst van Zyl, my colleague and friend from AfriForum, and we attended the NatCon conference, the National Conservatism Conference, where I was able to do a presentation or a speech about what's happening in South Africa, more particularly what the Afrikaner people are doing in South Africa, and also where we had a whole bunch of meetings and conversations with friends, old friends and new friends in Washington, D.C. From here, we will depart to New York City, where, among other things, we will launch the Afrikaner Foundation at an event hosted by the New York Young Republicans. So we are very much looking forward to that. But with me today is none other than Ernst van Zyl, whom I mentioned, who many of you know on social media as Conscious Caracal. He's at Con Caracal on X or Twitter, and he has a YouTube channel also by the same name, and a platform, An Alle Ernst, which is an Afrikaans podcast. And so Ernst is with me, and we're going to be talking about the bigger picture in as far as Afrikaners are concerned and the West is concerned. We have done a live stream on his YouTube channel, and I would encourage you to go and look it up, where we spoke about what our experience was at this past conference. And we talk more about the details. So we don't want to go too much into the details. There might be some repetition of what we discussed during this podcast, but for this conversation, we want to take one step back and talk about the bigger picture, talk about the Afrikaner people and the West, and where we fit in, what we see in America, what we witness coming here, and what we think about what is happening in the West. And we have some big ideas that we'd like to share with you. So with that intro, Ernst van Zyl, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Ernst. And yes, I've been working for AfriForum for 5 years now, and even in my own capacity, what I've seen is that not only domestically in South Africa is the view of Afrikaners and the view of Afrikaner organizations changing, but it's also happening internationally in as short a time as 5 years or 6 or 7 years. And you've been championing the Afrikaner cause internationally much longer, I think closer to a decade. So I think you've noticed the same thing.
Yeah, of course. Before we get into that, let's just, for curiosity's sake, for the listeners who have been following either of us or both of us and the work that AfriForum and our organizations have been doing, let's just go back to where we actually met and where our friendship and colleagueship started, if that's the correct word. We met in 2018, I believe. We've been following each other on social media, and we met at, I think it was the book launch, the launch of Kill the Boer book in June 2018. And later that year in September, I did a presentation in Parliament, in the South African Parliament, on behalf of AfriForum. I think it was the 6th of September. I remember it was the 6th of September because it was the day on which Hendrik Verwoerd was assassinated in Parliament, which of course is a relevant topic, given that we're talking from the US today and what happened over this past weekend. And the next morning, so it might have been the 7th of September then, I assume, we met in Stellenbosch, where you were, I think, finishing up your political sciences degree, and we spoke about getting you on board and joining AfriForum. Is that more or less correct?
Well, it wasn't at that point pitched in such a way that this is a job interview, but rather I was finishing up, yes, correct, my honors degree, and you wanted to follow up on, we had exchanged contact details at your book launch, and I said I wanted to become more involved in the Afrikaner cause and particularly use my talents in that regard. And you were visiting there for the parliamentary presentation, so you were able to fit in meeting me there and on close to Stellenbosch campus. So I remember it clearly, but I also remember very clearly how you were received in Parliament that day. And to tie it actually back to the conversations we've had, especially on that episode on my channel on the perception of Afrikaners' new international reputation. If you contrast how you were received in Parliament that day with how we are just domestically received as AfriForum today, it's also night and day. It's two completely different.
I mean, how we are received in Washington.
Well, no, in South Africa particularly. I mean, in Parliament there, I don't think there was anyone that perceived what you were saying there positively, but because of who you were, not because of the content of your presentation. And there's been that shift domestically in South Africa that I've noticed. I mean, now we still do presentations in Parliament, but the attacks are not nearly as vicious, not nearly as unfair as back then. And how I want to tie it back to internationally is that change in perception has now translated to the international stage as well.
Yes, yeah, I remember that was quite vicious how they responded to the presentation. It was about land reform and whether the constitution had to be changed. So people can look that up if they want, if they haven't seen the clip. I do remember when we had our conversation, I'm not sure if it was that conversation or in one of the follow-up conversations, we spoke about whether you would be willing to actually make your real name and identity known, because back then you were just a student, you were podcasting, you were doing these you were making videos, and everyone knew you as Conscious Caracal. Was that a big deal for you coming out as Ernst van Zyl?
Well, I still remember it. It was the day that I started working for AfriForum. That week, I uploaded a video on my YouTube channel, pretty much asking my own identity, putting my identity out there. And I remember it clearly. I remember clicking publish on the video and realizing that there's no going back now. And it was a different time politically as well in South Africa when it comes to student politics. So if you were politically vocal online, you would be targeted at university. I mean, there would be attempts to have you expelled. It was the time of fees must fall and roads must fall. It was a political environment on campus that was incredibly hostile. I don't think it has much improved. I still hear today that a lot of students at South Africa's universities are afraid and terrified to speak their mind when it comes to politics, because only a certain viewpoint or ideology is tolerated, and it's very viciously enforced. But back then, even it was the same, and I mean, it was under that premise that I used the pseudonym at the time. I didn't want to jeopardize my studies just because I wanted to speak my mind online. So I could do the best of both worlds. I could put my honest opinion out there, and at the same time not be expelled if I were to be targeted by radical leftists. But then, and I know I'm in a very privileged position. Getting the job at AfriForum meant that I could continue speaking my mind, but now I have the opportunity to do it under my real name, which I know is not the reality for the vast majority of people out there. That's why I think anonymity is so prevalent still in our times. The majority of people will still face consequences at their place of work or at their university for actually opinions that are not controversial, just opinions that go against the grain of the ruling zeitgeist or the main views of the most powerful views of the time.
Now, before we go into the topic of this conversation, I just have one more question about that, and you might have been asked this before, but just for the listeners' sake, why did you choose Conscious Caracal as a name? I think a lot of people, our listeners abroad, don't necessarily know what a caracal is. So what's the story behind the pseudonym?
Well, there wasn't a lot of thought or brand research that went into it. It was in the moment. So I just wanted to create a throwaway account so I can publish one video to put my thoughts out there on a terrorist attack actually that happened in Europe back at that time. And so I just wanted to create a once-off YouTube video, and then I thought, well, I'll create a once-off Twitter account as well, just to promote it on the website, and then I'll leave it at that. And in that moment, I thought, well, I'm going to need a name. And my one of my nicknames was Rooikat because I have a red in my beard. And Rooikat is a South African animal that's called a caracal in English. So I thought, well, I'll call myself Caracal then, but I also want to create like a little bit of an alliteration. So I just thought of a word that alliterates with Caracal. That was it. It was supposed to be a throwaway account, throwaway one-off thing. And that video did so well, and that those posts did so well that I thought, well, I might as well make more.
It's stuck, yes. So, all right, so let's fast forward to now. So you've done quite some traveling. This is actually the first time you've been to America, the USA, and we're here for a bunch of things that I mentioned in the introduction. So, and we've been talking a lot about our observations. So let's start with what we've been observing in America. And one thing, perhaps to start the conversation from my side, is that we hear from our conservative friends in America a lot of concerns, and you might even say complaints about America, and especially a place like Washington. Washington is a swamp, is what we always hear, and it's a very bad place. And when we got here, our first impression was very positive. And it might be because what we see when we arrive in DC is beautiful buildings, beautiful architecture, a city that's fairly clean, at least compared to what we are used to in South Africa. Well, is that more or less what your observation was?
Well, yes. I don't think we've ever felt unsafe in the streets, but also with the big caveat or the big footnote there that we are staying in I think the center of the city where all the monuments and museums and the White House, in the vicinity of all the monuments here. So I do think it is the better part of the city. I have no doubt that there are parts of the city where it's probably not as safe as here. And I've spoken to some of the locals, and I've gotten that impression. They say that crime is worsening in the city, and that it is not the part where we're currently staying, but rather other parts of it. So, but I can give my impression of the parts that we have seen, and that is almost like the most famous part of the city is where all the heritage is, where the history is. And I'm absolutely blown away by the layers and layers of American history that's on display here through statues, monuments, museums, everything telling a story, the story of America to a large extent.
And beautiful buildings.
Absolutely. The beautiful architecture. There is some modern architecture here and there, but it's really in the minority, the majority of buildings. And I think we've joked about the fact that there's so many buildings here that would be considered remarkable buildings, remarkable pieces of architecture in South Africa, but here they're normal.
Yeah. Contrast that then to our arrival in New York. So we arrived in New York. We took a train?
Yes.
From New York to Washington.
We briefly saw New York, just a glimpse.
Yeah, we just saw the area around Penn Station. Quickly, we're going to New York next week or later this week. And so it was strange that when you get to New York, and at least what we saw on the subway in New York, it didn't look like America. It felt like
the world.
Yes, it looked like a sample of the world. Perhaps you might even say a disproportionate sample, in the sense that more African and Asian and Middle Eastern than European, or what they call heritage American, or white people. There were actually very few. I think at one stage we were the only two white people on the subway, at least in our cart. And so this is quite strange, and it ties up to this bigger conversation that we'll get to. But you know, what is an American? And it's a very important question, but it seems that it's a very controversial question in America right now, and especially a city like New York, but to an extent Washington has become so diverse that you don't really know what it is anymore. What's your view on that?
It all comes back to that question that Samuel Huntington posed the prediction rather that he made in the 90s in Clash of Civilizations, or the West and the Rest essay, where he said that the post-Cold War world will be defined by one question, that is, who are we? And it's a question that every nation is going to have to ask, and they're going to need an answer for it. If you don't have an answer, you're not going to make it. And that has been my impression. I mean, as we said, we're not going into the details of our visit. That was completely covered on my channel, on the Conscious Caracal channel, where we gave detailed feedback. But one of the things that stood out from the National Conservative Convention where we were is that almost every one of the presentations that we listened to, in the background was this question of who are we, or not just as Americans, but as Westerners, as any type of Western culture, wherever we may find ourselves. And I think controversially, and I told you this at the time, many of the speakers didn't seem to know the answer, or the question wasn't tackled. It was there in the background, but it wasn't explicitly tackled. Ironically enough, we're sitting here in DC now just getting the news that J.D. Vance has been chosen by Donald Trump as his vice president pick. And he did a presentation at NatCon, and actually he was the very last speech of the entire conference. And his entire speech was built on the bedrock or the foundation of who are we as Americans. So I found that very refreshing. I remember I told you, it's funny that constantly during the conference we've been referencing the fact that who are we is a constant in the background factor, and now the very last speech explicitly addresses.
Yeah, it's many of the speakers, whether deliberately or not, probably not deliberately, but got close to this question of who are we, or answering it, and then they went to a different topic. And J.D. Vance actually spoke about this, who are we? And the one thing that stood out for us is him saying that, I might be paraphrasing, but it's not sufficient to say that America is an idea. And we've been hearing this, and I'm sure the listeners have been hearing this a lot, that to be an American is to love freedom and to be hardworking and
to own a gun.
To own a gun. But by that logic, we're both Americans.
Right.
So there has to be something more than that.
It can't just be that you are a resident of an economic zone called America,
or you live in a particular geographical area.
Wow.
Then it's not a territorial identity; it's a cultural identity. And so this brings me to one of the things that we saw in Washington that was not just strange but bizarre to us is the churches. So, and I have to say this is. In America's defense, if I can do that, I'm convinced that this is not representative of America, perhaps just representative of the left in America or the churches in Washington. But almost every church we see has political slogans in front, slogans like Free Palestine, and then rainbow flags, trans flags.
But explicitly, not like some little sticker that someone put up on the wall. The church itself is putting it on the main facade where you enter. It's almost like they're proclaiming it to the world.
Massive banners up the staircases towards the church. One we saw, well, not one, several we saw where the banner or the flag is part of the sign that was designed and printed.
Yeah.
And this is very odd to us, and we actually laughed that the only church that we saw that doesn't have it is the Scientology church. So the joke was that the Scientologists are the most normal or the least political.
Yeah, but what makes it the most absurd, well, firstly for us, it's not something we see in South Africa. We don't see this explicitly like ideological stance being taken by churches, almost to a cartoonish degree. But then also what makes it even more absurd or strange is that it's all in one direction. So it's not like, you can see this is a Republican church, so they put up photographs of Donald Trump and whatever. Like, no, they're all explicitly...
We didn't see any pro-Israel churches.
No, we just saw all churches in one direction, and it's all in the direction of the rainbow flag and trans identity. Yeah. Identical. The messaging is identical everywhere. And I think that's also something that stood out to me.
And so this links up to the broader conversation that we want to have is what's happening in the West. And I know we both have been talking about this, that in essence, this flag is not anymore it's not about gay people having the right to get married. It's much more or much less than that, depending on how you view it. It to a large extent has become a religious symbol. It is a symbol that stands for much more than that. And we've heard now at this conference that there's this debate about schools where a lot of the schools in America have put up the rainbow flag or the trans flag. And now some places they started up putting the 10 Commandments.
Just before we continue, I don't know what to call it. It's the flag. It's the rainbow flag, but it has like the trans colors on it and the black and brown to represent Black Lives Matter. But it's this weird. I don't think it has a name, but it's like I don't want to call it the woke flag because that just sounds so informal and slangy.
Yeah. Well, I looked it up a few months ago, and I saw that there are so many flags that you can't stay updated with which is the latest one. But it's basically the flag for everyone except white straight people. So
it's the coalition of the rest.
Yes, the West and the rest, exactly. Yeah. It's and now we can talk about what does that actually stand for. A flag like that is much more defined by what it is against than what it actually represents or what it wants to achieve. But the point I want to get to is, so I mentioned that when some schools recently put up the 10 Commandments here in America, it was very controversial, and there's a big issue, and there are Christians who are against this for technical reasons and so forth.
It's now actually a big debate that we were exposed to when we didn't even know it was a thing, and then at the conference everyone was talking about this is the big debate going on. Or should you be allowed to put up the 10 Commandments? And
yeah, and so you've made the point before, and I've made it, so I'll ask you to explain it. These new ideologies are in many ways a new religion. It has very strong religious characters or characteristics. And so in a sense, it makes sense in a weird way to put them up at a church. But a concern is that perhaps what has happened here is that the churches have become so secular and so shallow and have lost so much of their Christian tradition that to an extent it has become a void, a religious void, which is now being filled with a new religion. How
being captured, yeah. And it absolutely functions like a religion with its own blasphemy laws or its own forms of blasphemy, its own forms of the sacred, its own iconography, its own idea of Satan, and its own idea of I wanted to say its own idea of redemption, but it's the strange thing. It doesn't have, as Christianity does, the sense of redemption. There's no way.
Eternal punishment
and eternal admission that you are morally inferior if you are white or straight or whatever of the or Christian, any of the designated evil categories under this new religion.
They have their own prophets, their own sacred texts.
Absolutely. And yeah, but there's no sense of mercy and there's no sense of redemption. There's no way to you can't be saved from original sin. As in Christianity, we have been saved from original sin by Jesus Christ. But in the woke worldview, or in this critical theory woke worldview, whatever you want to call it, there is no saving a white person. There is no saving a Christian. There is no saving a straight person. You are inherently marked. But just a final point there on the school point is that, so America has this concept of separating church and state, this liberal concept. But what happens now is that because this wokeness is not viewed as a religion, it can be put up in classrooms and in schools by the very same people that are proclaiming to be like the big champions of separating church and state. So we're not going to have any Christian icons or any Christian slogans or any Christianity in the classroom, because the classroom is no place for religion according to this doctrine. But of course there can be a rainbow flag, there can be a Black Lives Matter sign, all of that, because that's the hack. That's the hack that they found, is that our religion can be displayed in class because it isn't a religion. It's just, as they would say, it's just morality. It's just common sense.
Religion presenting itself as an ideology.
Yes.
And also it has a very, going down this religion comparison with religion line, it seems that it has a very strong conception of evil, what is evil, but not really what is good, what is the good. To the extent that it has a conception of good or the good, it would be doing whatever you want to do.
No restraints. Yeah.
Yes, no bonds, no restraints. Some, not even Epicurean. It's much more extreme than that. It's just smoke what you want, use the drugs that you want, sleep with who you want, have no responsibilities, no attachment, do whatever you want. And then you are free.
But anyone that stands in your way, whether that be the school or the authority in your community or your parents, whoever stands in your way is evil, because they are limiting your ultimate freedom.
Yes. So we can go down this rabbit hole, but this is a very important topic. But so let's take this now to Afrikaners and the West. So let's just a quick overview of what we discussed in the other interview, the discussion we've had on your YouTube. Let's start with, if you listen to this podcast, you might have heard the first episode where I spoke about 2012, my first visit to the US, which is now 12 years ago, when that a very senior person in the United Nations said to me, we can see that the cracks are showing in South Africa, but we don't want to talk about it. And it would be better for you not to try, because we have decided that South Africa is a miracle, it's a success story, and you are basically spoiling our fun if you are raising concerns about what's happening in South Africa. Now that has changed, and we mentioned around 2018 was a big year, partly because that was when the South African Parliament adopted this motion that the state has to be empowered to expropriate private property without compensation, and to do that they would have to change the constitution, partly due to Tucker Carlson, who has taken interest in South Africa. Not only Tucker, he was just the biggest platform when he was still with Fox News, and partly due to Donald Trump's tweet about South Africa. And so there was, in 2018, a lot of focus on South Africa.
There were also, I think, a lot of pieces in publications like the New York Times that were talking.
CNN, Sky News, certainly every big international news outlet started doing stories on South Africa. And it's maybe I should add this because I think it's relevant. So I was on Tucker Carlson's show, what was it called? Tucker Carlson Tonight in 2018. And after that, we had a flood of interest from America into South Africa. But most of it was journalists and publications who were hell-bent on trying to discredit what we are doing as a way of discrediting Trump after Tucker's show, and of course Trump's tweet, and discrediting Tucker and Fox News. And I remember one journalist coming from America to interview me back in South Africa, and the entire interview, or most of the interview at least, consisted of questions about Trump and Fox News. So the journalist would say, well, Fox News once said the following, are you comfortable with this? Or Trump said this, do you agree with that? And so I stopped him at one stage and I said, what is this interview about? Why are you interviewing me about Trump and Fox News or Tucker Carlson? Because it seemed like, in a sense, Trump, especially commenting on this, opened some doors, and in a way you could say closed some doors, because some people seem to be hell-bent on trying to discredit everything we do just in an attempt to get to Trump. So you can comment on that, but what I want to get to is that in a way has also changed where we are now with our experience, especially this year, a little bit earlier this year at CPAC Hungary, and now especially in Washington at the NatCon conference, and the people we're seeing who weren't necessarily at the conference, that there's now a very strong focus on what are the Afrikaners doing in South Africa, not so much what's the problem in South Africa, what are you doing about that? So is that more or less your view or your perception?
Yeah, well, as I said, not to get lost in the details of all the conversations we've had, all the people we've met, but we are absolutely blown away by the amount of interest we've received. So just quickly summarize it, in the past, you actually had to approach people and say, well, I convinced them almost that South Africa is worth your time and the Afrikaners are a community you should be keeping an eye on. That was how I experienced it in the past. Now people are, but we didn't have enough time to chat to everyone. Everyone just wanted, firstly, they know about what's going on in South Africa. Secondly, they know the positive and the negative. So the second thing is they don't just know about the negative crises of the electricity crisis, the unemployment crisis, the crime crisis, the farm murder or rural security and farm murder crisis, the racial discriminatory laws issues. They know about all of that, but now they want to know, what are you guys doing about? We've heard and we've read that you are not just laying down to die or giving up or leaving. You are actually staying and, controversially enough, shocking many people, actually hopeful for the future. And it grabs their imagination.
So you wrote a piece, I think it was a year ago. Might have
2022.
Yeah, 2 years ago, called A Time to Dig Trenches. And I reference that because I have gotten a lot of feedback on that piece, and I'm sure you as well. And it was published, I think, originally in was it IM 1776? Yes. And I've spoken with people who have said to me, even up to now, who have said to me how important that piece was to them. And recently we spoke with someone who went as far as saying that piece has changed his life. So just give us I want to encourage people to look it up. The piece is called, it's A Time
to Dig Trenches on IM 1776.
So just give us a quick overview. What was the point that you were trying to make, and why do you think people took it so seriously?
I think it was because my point was I tried to condense into one piece an answer to the question, why don't you just immigrate? Why don't all the Afrikaners just leave?
Yeah, we get that a lot. All over the world, people say, why don't you come to our country?
Get that a lot, and we've gotten that a lot up until the point where people are now starting to realize. So we're getting it less and less. We still got some of those questions this visit as well, but more people are starting to realize now that the Afrikaners can't just leave. And I mean, that's what I wanted to communicate with that piece. So I used the history of the Afrikaners and the history of the Boers to explain why sometimes there is a time to leave, like the Voortrekkers did when they left the Cape Colony in 1838. But sometimes there's also a time to dig a trench, as the Boers then decided when the British invaded at the start of the Second Anglo-Boer War. And I didn't come up with the idea of there's a time to leave and a time to dig trenches. That's actually the excellent expression of our good friend Russell Lamberti. And me and him, it actually goes a long way, this piece, because it started with an interview that I did with him in AfriForum studio that did phenomenally well on particularly this idea. And then from that idea, I just kept thinking about that.
How can people watch the interview?
That's also on my channel, on my YouTube channel. You can just search on YouTube A Time to Dig Trenches, Russell Lamberti, and you'll find it on YouTube. And that interview just got my mind going, and I started particularly writing this piece using the history of the Boers as a vehicle to explain why not only Afrikaners are staying put in South Africa and building for the future, but why that's actually an example for many communities out there in the Western world. That the central idea is that at some point you have to stop running. At some point, if everyone's just running, then you run out of higher ground to run to. At some point, you're going to have to dig a trench and stop.
And you lose everything you've built there where you are, where you're running from.
And the dark part of it is that if you don't do this, then you're leaving that hard choice for your ancestors. If you don't make a stand, then you're forcing your grandchildren to make a stand. Yeah. So rather you than them.
Yes. And so it's relevant that it's quite striking even that the metaphor comes from the Boer War, when we of course fought against the British. And it's very strange to see, especially this sentiment coming from England now, more so than America, where there's this strange thing now. England certainly has problems, as every Western country and every country in the world does, some more than others. But there's a strange, almost a movement that we're seeing in England where people are talking about leaving. Why it's time to pack up and leave.
A lot of older people are encouraging the young people, the youth, to leave because according to them, there's no future.
And then the question is, where do you go? Do you go to America? It's not as if America doesn't have problems. Do you go to France? Do you go to South Africa? So the point is, everyone has problems, and somewhere we need to take a stand. And I think that's what I took from your piece is we are all in different areas of what you might call the same struggle or the same battle, and I think overarchingly we could say that the big ideological battle of our age is it's a war against fragmentation or against disintegration, where one side wants to preserve the things that they have inherited and the other side wants to destroy these things. And now if you believe that it's not going very well where you are, you just want to move somewhere else, then you are losing that ground, you're losing that territory. And I do think that there are some issues in America that are worse than South Africa, and there are some issues in England that are worse than South Africa. But if we can say in South Africa, we're going to stay here and we're going to fight, we're going to fight for what is ours. It's a defensive, when I say fight, I mean it in a defensive way. Then surely people in England and America should be able to say the same thing.
And that's actually a sentiment we've heard quite a bit now here in the States as well. People almost jokingly or self-deprecatingly saying that if the Afrikaners can find hope for the future and build, and the courage to build for the future, then other Westerners don't have an excuse. Just a little footnote there when it comes to leaving or digging a trench and you can't keep running forever. That doesn't mean if you're, for example, an Afrikaner in the Afrikaner diaspora that you're evil or a traitor. It just means that, for example, if you left South Africa and you're residing in the UK now, you can't now, when things go bad in the UK, flee to another country and just keep fleeing the decay. You've made your choice to leave South Africa, but you almost now have a responsibility to your new home.
You might have good reasons why you made that.
Absolutely.
Many people do.
Absolutely. But at the same time, I think it goes into the realm of immorality when you just keep leaving every time when things get rough. You just go to the next place. You never make a stand. You just become like you try to flee from your problems forever. So I think the Afrikaner diaspora still has a very big role to play in getting our message out there, supporting what we do in South Africa. But I also think at the same time, wherever you may find yourself, if you are part of the Afrikaner diaspora, you almost have a responsibility to fight for your home. You can't pack up and leave again.
Yeah, so that's why we say that a lot of people have left South Africa, but if you have left, that doesn't make you a traitor, but it can make you an ambassador. You can be an ambassador there where you are for your own people and where you come from. And we've seen a lot of people do that. And it was very, very beneficial or very good for us. So we'd like to encourage people listening to us who are either Afrikaners who have left or just who support our bigger cause to play some small role there where you are. And there are many things that
I have no doubt can do. But I have no doubt this shift in this new positive view of Afrikaners in the international community, I have no doubt that the Afrikaner diaspora has played a role in that change.
So let's get back to this about the Afrikaners. We feel, and I mentioned this in at NatCon in my speech, which will be published sometime on YouTube, that it was a big deal for us, and it still is, and it really is emotional talking about that because Samuel Huntington, I think you mentioned him earlier, but he somewhere in the Clash of Civilizations, sort of in passing, he talks about South Africa, and he says that. And again, I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the book in front of me, but something along the lines of the Afrikaners see themselves as Westerners, but they aren't seen as Westerners by the rest of the world or by the West. So we've been, in many ways, rejected by the West. And we've felt like we've been treated like pariahs for decades, or the son that's kicked out of the house. And we feel that that's changing, that people are sort of rediscovering South Africa and rediscovering the Afrikaners. And now the question is, why do you think this is happening? Because as we mentioned, it's not just people are recognizing that there are problems in South Africa. People want to look to the solution. So why do you think there's this rediscovery happening?
Well, yeah, the rediscovery is happening. If I'm allowed to indulge a little bit in speculation, I would think it is because a lot of Westerners in the world are becoming disillusioned with elections as the primary or exclusive path towards change. I think a lot of leaders have been elected there, especially in recent years, on big promises of bringing about change, turning things around, and it's just more of the same, more of the same, more of the status quo wherever you see. I mean, a good example would be the UK, where Brexit was this massive populist reaction to the status quo, or the elites of that country not acting in the best interests of their country, just making horrible decision after horrible decision. And now they got Brexit, but then nothing really changed. It was still this. They weren't part of the European Union anymore, but none of the for example, mass immigration accelerated. It didn't decrease under the Conservatives. So I think that's just a single example of the many examples out there of people in the West becoming disillusioned with the idea that you just have to vote harder and then you get a real change. Doesn't mean you shouldn't vote. I mean, we as Afrikaners know we're probably in South Africa one of the demographics with the highest voter turnout percentage, and that's a good thing. That makes you disproportionately powerful in a democratic system. But at the same time, what you're doing by voting is you're doing the bare minimum. You can't just go wait in line, draw a cross on a piece of paper, and then pat yourself on the back and say, I've made my sacrifice for the next 5 years. I've done my duty, I've done my part. No, you've done the bare minimum. So voting is important, but not... and I mean, what I'm describing here, that that shift in thinking and outlook that has happened among many Afrikaners, that voting is not enough, voting is important, but not the pinnacle, is, I think, something that's inspiring a lot of Westerners. They're seeing Afrikaners in South Africa still hopeful for the future and taking their destiny into their own hands without becoming hopeless. I think we've heard so many comments from people from France, from England, from America, saying that they wish their people were more like us. But I think in that sense of building for the future, doesn't matter what, even if elections don't go our way, we don't just sit back and accept defeat and say, well, now there's nothing we can do.
And the strange paradox, that's what we hear, that there seems to be a paradox with us in the sense that we have much bigger problems, but we are much more optimistic. And this optimism lies in us having how we say it is we've rediscovered an ancient truth and an ancient wisdom that much of the West has lost. It's not a new idea; it's an old idea.
It's not reinventing the wheel. It's rediscovering.
It's rediscovering the wheel that was developed thousands of years ago. And this ancient truth is just that in many ways, at least in the modern world, most of our problems can in some way be traced back to the government, but that doesn't mean that the government has to be the solution to the problem. The ancient wisdom is that the only sustainable solution is going back to the community, reinvigorating our communities, rediscovering our sense of who we are. And to quote Edmund Burke, who said, when bad men combine, the good must associate. And so there's an element of knowing what the good is in what Burke said, but there's also an element of organizing collectively. And to be collectivist has become a very negative buzzword in the modern world, also in conservative circles, as long as you're not collectivist. But we've gotten past that long ago. We recognize that it's good to organize in community.
Many of our institutions are collectivist, or let's rather use the term cooperative, I think is better. Collectivist almost sounds like in every situation the individual doesn't matter, which is not true.
Or communitarian.
Yeah, well, families are cooperative, communities are cooperative, schools are cooperative, churches are cooperative. All of these are cooperative institutions where sometimes the individual is not the primary focus. Sometimes the collective is more important. Doesn't mean it always trumps that. But also, what's also important in that regard is the fact that I think Afrikaners have realized that we are also the libertarian or the classic libertarian answer is also not the whole truth. It's also not the whole answer. We just need to limit the government or make the government as small as possible. Everything will be fine. It's like Oren McIntyre, someone else that we were able to meet in person at NatCon, says the small government is not the goal. It's not the pinnacle of what you're trying to achieve. The goal is strong communities. The goal is strong alternative institutions, alternative centers of power to counter government, which will naturally make the government less and less relevant. That's the goal, not to just legislate, try to make the government smaller and smaller, but you're not. Then you just create a vacuum, which is going to be filled by something else. You need to be creating an alternative to it.
Yeah, so I've mentioned before that, sort of jokingly, that there's a Lord of the Rings reference for everything. And the one Lord of the Rings reference we've been discussing this week is Isildur taking the ring. That famous scene in the movie as well, where he's in Mount Doom. He can just throw the ring into the fire, and then he decides not to do it because he wants to use the ring for good. And the ring has this massive potential, but at the end of the day, it ends up corrupting him. And in many ways, that's we can say that it's a metaphor for the government or the state. And so it's easy to say something along the lines of, we need to vote so that we can win the election, so that we can get control of the government or the state, so that we can use the government and the state to implement these solutions. So we've been joking, saying we need to give the government more power so that we can use the government to make the government smaller. And that's a very, very dangerous way of thinking about it. Now, we're not anarchists in the sense that we say there shouldn't be a government or there shouldn't be a state. There's room for it. But at the end of the day, that remains an artificial construct, an artificial identity, you might say, your identity as a member of the state, when your natural identity is your identity as a member of the community. And so this is something that we believe is one very important way in which we can contribute to the conversation in the West.
And I think that's the message that we gave to many people at NatCon and here in Washington as well, is that we come with good news and bad news. The bad news is that a lot of South Africa's problems could very likely be their future. But the good news is we're already working on the solutions and pioneering some of the solutions. And pioneering means that some of our solutions are not going to work. We're trial and error. We're trying things and seeing if they work. And the good news for the rest of the Western world is because we're testing and experimenting with solutions, they can learn from our mistakes, but also from our successes. So that's the positive and the negative that we're coming with to these types of conferences. And I think it's resonating with people. And just something else that I wanted to add to that. Do you have a thought on that before we move on? We were talking about identity. Who are we? And I see there are a lot of people that struggle with this idea, but you sometimes refer to yourself as a culture from Africa or an African culture, but also now you're saying you're Westerners. How does that work? MP van Wyk Low wrote about it quite a bit. He said that we as Afrikaners always have to remember that we have to keep two traditions alive and two influences alive at all costs for every generation. We can't lose either. The one is to always remember that we are of the Old West, and secondly, that we cannot... he actually said we have two responsibilities. The one responsibility is to always remember we are of the Old West, and secondly is that we should not ignore the influences of Africa on our culture, which means that losing either of those means you lose a set part of yourself. And I think that's what's critical when it comes to Afrikaners, is that, of course, what is a civilization, or what is a culture? Well, there's many elements to it, but some of the basic building blocks are your religion, your worldview or your philosophy, your legal system, your sense of justice, how are disputes approached, and how are people that transgress punished. An idea of a judicial system. I mean, in the Afrikaner case, it would be Roman Dutch law. But in each one of those cases, it's Western. So our worldview is Western. Our idea of justice and the judicial system that we subscribe to is Western. Our language has very strong roots in Western language, in Germanic languages, even though it has very strong influences from Africa and from the East. And our idea, our philosophy, now this is very broadly speaking, but our general principles are Western principles, what our hierarchy of what is most important. But that just indicates that we are part of Western civilization. Africa is not a civilization. Africa is a continent filled with many cultures. While Western civilization can be defined and it can be pointed to where its foundations lie, in the same sense that there is not an Australian civilization or a South American civilization or a East African civilization. There's also Africa is just a continent with many cultures within it, African cultures and Western cultures. And that's, I think, what Afrikaners are, is that we are a Western culture of Africa. And that's the best way I can explain how we are African as a culture, but also Western in our roots and our foundation.
So to close off the conversation, I often quote Kali Kriel, CEO of AfriForum, who has said several years ago that he's now more optimistic than he was 10 years ago. So let's end off with that. How would you explain to someone who doesn't live in South Africa, who remarks that we are quite optimistic? Why are we optimistic when there's so much to complain about in South Africa? We don't even have electricity all the time. We are often described as the murder and rape capital in the world. The government is collapsing. Everything is collapsing, almost everything, except tax revenue, of course. But why are we optimistic?
Because we're experiencing something that a lot of Westerners are only dreaming about, and that's actually seeing tangible change happen out of our own hands, tangible change that we have a control over. So everyone wants change. I think maybe you'll find an exception, but I think every single political campaign is based upon bringing about change, whether that be Obama saying, yes, we can, or Donald Trump saying, make America great again, or Cyril Ramaphosa's New Dawn. Everything is based on bringing about change, but many of these promises never materialize. As we said earlier, I think a lot of Westerners are getting quite tired of empty promises from politicians saying, oh, we will end mass immigration, or we will turn crime around, or we will bring back secure the border, bring back economic growth, make our military internationally respected again, or we will stop foreign intervention, or we will, whatever. The list of different promises from different angles goes on and on and on. and the vast majority of them never materialize. And people feel hopeless. They feel like, what can we do? Well, and the answers that they receive, unfortunately, is just vote harder. If you vote harder, you might get it. And we as Afrikaners have kind of written that idea off. We still vote because even though, as I think it was Epicurus that said, you might not be interested in politics, but politics is certainly interested in you. And the same goes for party politics. Or whoever wins the election in South Africa or America will affect everyone's lives that will be under their administration. But at the same time, just to wrap up, why are we hopeful? Because we have actually found a vehicle to bring about change. It might not be world-changing. It might not be the massive, earth-shattering change that saves an entire civilization or a country or whatever, or a people within a matter of years. But it is tangible change. We can see our actions actually having a real world impact and our promises materializing. I made this point on Twitter this week where some high top brass EFF person replied to one of my tweets and said, it's high time we create a Black Afri Forum. And I said, cool, you can do that. Just remember that unlike the EFF, we actually build the schools that we promise.
Yeah.
And that's the difference.
You don't vote them into existence.
The EFF
into existence.
The EFF promised a school 5 years ago and it hasn't materialized. Solidarity Movement promised a technical college. I don't know when the promise was made, but it was finished in 2020 under budget and under time.
Yeah.
That's the difference, and that's what we do.
Yeah. So, Ernst van Zyl, I mentioned this before, but maybe you can give a quick overview. How can people follow you on social media? Where are you?
So I'm still under Conscious Caracal. I just like the brand, so I'm not gonna change it. I'm still posting under that name on X and on YouTube. So on YouTube, I do interviews with interesting people. I also make some videos of my own. And on X, I share my thoughts on politics, both internal in South Africa, domestically and abroad, with a predominantly focus on both my YouTube channel and my Twitter account. I focus on I'm trying to make commentary that's not only relevant to South Africa, even though I'm predominantly focused on South Africa, but commentary that can also be relevant to people on the outside looking in, highlighting lessons, highlighting threats, highlighting things that I think people on the outside and on the inside of South Africa should be, I think, paying attention to. En dan as jy Afrikaans is en jy wil al my Afrikaanse inhoud kyk, ek doen ook moeite om soveel as moontlik van my Engelse inhoud na Afrikaans te vertaal, en jy kan dit vind op my In Alle Ernst program. Dit is ook op YouTube en op enige podsending platform wat jy gebruik.
Ernst van Zyl, thank you very much. Maybe just some quick closing remarks. So this is still a new podcast. So if you listen to this, I would really encourage you and invite you to share this episode, to encourage people to subscribe to the podcast. We're on most podcast platforms, at least all the biggest ones. So please subscribe so that you can stay updated. And also the Afrikaner Foundation is a new institution within the broader solidarity movement, aimed primarily at garnering support for the work that the Afrikaner community is doing through our various institutions. That includes tangible support such as cooperation with institutions outside of South Africa, policy influence with regard to South Africa, with regard to the Afrikaner people, and it also includes fundraising. So I would also encourage you to go to our website, afrikaner.org, that's ORG, and you can read up about the various projects that we're involved with. And if you support this, please, I would encourage you to make some form of a donation. You can just type in afrikaner.org/support, or just click on support on the website, and you will see there are different ways in which you can support. So I would encourage you to do that. And yeah, finally, Ernst van Zyl, thank you very much, and we look forward to speaking with you again on this podcast.
Yeah, and I look forward to the rest of our visit here in the United States, and I hope that we can continue to make the progress that we've already made.
Thank you very much.